Welcome to the chat, the New Bedford Lights video program. This is Jack Spillane, and today the topic is the year ahead for the scallop industry. We have an all-star guest list today. Tony Alvarez, a longtime scalloper and owner of six boats, I think. Welcome, Tony.
Thank
We
you.
also have Eric Hansen, a scallop boat owner himself and representative from New Bedford to the New England Fisheries Management Council. Drew Minkowitz, an attorney with the industry group, the Fisheries Survival Fund, and Jim Kendall, of course, who's familiar to you all, the executive director of New Bedford Seafood Consulting, and also a former scalloper and a 50-year veteran of the industry. Welcome all.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So, President Trump, on his first day in office, signed this halt to offshore wind projects and a review of all end of any new lease permits and a review of all the ones that are already there. This is going to help the scallop industry, Tony?
Absolutely, yeah. We can't afford to lose any grounds. Absolutely.
Yeah. What do you think, Drew? Is this a good?
No, it's a huge benefit for sure. Scallop industry has worked very hard to keep offshore wind farms off of scallop grounds. So the fact that new areas aren't going to be into consideration for lease areas for the next 4 years, that's a huge burden off of the industry. It's one thing we don't have to look out for a little while. And then also knowing that the areas that aren't fully permitted won't likely get their permits going forward for the next 4 years and won't be built out for some time. That's another huge burden off the industry because we won't lose those grounds to wind farms in the next 4 years.
Yeah. Any downside if they reverse the projects that have already permitted? I know some boats go out to do a little bit of work, not much compared to scalloping. Eric?
I I can comment on that. Tony might be a better one to comment. He is actually doing some work uh, for wind energy development alongside his scalloping. Uh, I think the executive order or the memorandum, however you want to say it, is a short-term thing for the scallop industry of bonus. We'll see if it turns into long-term. It'll happen, short-term for this administration, but things can change in 4 years. But 4 years will give us a chance to gather more science, gather some more impacts studies on what's already happened. There have been a lot of acoustic surveys that may have impacted scallops. We don't know for sure, but it'll give us time to document a lot of things that have happened on the water.
Yeah, some of those turbines that are already in the water, Tony, interfering with the fishing grounds and interfering with routes. Would you just as soon see them reverse it and take them apart?
I don't think that, from what I understand, even if they were to be decommissioning them basically means cutting them off 15 feet above the ground. I mean, they've been pile driven into the ground, God knows how many feet. Then they dump rocks all around them. So I don't know if they have a vacuum, they could suck up all these rocks. It's pretty much like the towers offshore. They got cut off, and they're there forever and a day, especially the scouring protection, the rocks. So I'd be beyond shocked if they were to be taken out. Like I said, even decommissioning them, it basically, again, 15 feet above the surface. So it's a dead zone for fishing, pretty much. For trawling.
Yeah, for trawling, sure. And Jack, to that point, as far as to temper people's expectations about what can and cannot be done, our regulatory system is set up in a way, and it's a good thing that you can't just create a regulation or just do away with a regulation at the snap of a finger. And so for them to take away permits that have been issued by the federal government, it's an extensive process, and they have to go through several steps, and there's some significant hurdles that you have to show that it's justified and there's a rational basis for doing it, and you have the facts to support it, and you have that meet the statutory requirements. I'm not saying it's impossible, but people need to realize that it's a significant hurdle and it's not something easily done. And obviously, whoever has that permit is going to challenge any attempt to remove it, and it's not going to be an easy process to do.
So they're not going to be gone tomorrow, it's fair to say.
Yes. I mean, the interesting thing is the lifting of the order for Vineyard Wind, one of the larger projects out there. But now they have to remove, I believe, almost all the blades that were installed so far,
22.
put in the new ones. And, I don't know the full logistics scale of all of that, but to me, that is significant. And, and are you a wind farm if you have no blades? I think is a fair question to ask.
Absolutely. Jim, what do you think? It's got to be good news, President Trump's order.
Yeah, yes, it is. I mean, first of all, let me put some perspective on my role in this. Is I haven't fished in over 15 years due to an injury, but I've been working very closely with Vineyard Wind. And a couple of points I'd like to make about that is I was one of the strongest opponents to offshore wind when they first started talking about coming in. And there was a gentleman there at the time who was in charge by the name of Eric Stevens. And he asked me if I could help him meet with fishermen on a smaller basis. We were meeting down at one of the clubs, and we have 100, 150 fishermen screaming all at the same time, which is the way we usually operate. And he wanted a smaller meeting. And from that point on, they were able to deal with some of the industry. I've got to say, in my perspective, I think we were lucky that Vineyard Wind was the first company to come in and plant some poles in the water, because a lot of the other companies don't have the same respect or concern for the fishing industry.
Very true.
Cape Wind proved that. I mean, they refused to speak to fishermen or even the locals when they started talking about, developing in Nantucket Sound. So, like I say, I think Vineyard Wind learned a great lesson from that. And when I met and talked and spoke with them and brought issues before them, they seemed to be receptive to my best understanding. So, like I say, I think we were lucky to have them to start out with and do the groundwork. To that point, though, to further it, I'm not wild about it, no matter how good they are, because I don't believe that it's proper for them to be out there, because I don't think they can survive in some of that weather that we're likely to see. So that's liable to cause more problems, similar to what occurred with the first blade mishap, or our first blade mishap. And like you said, they're required now to remove all the blades that were built or manufactured up in Quebec, Ontario. So there's a lot of issues that still remain to be solved with what we have already.
Tony?
Yeah. So they have to remove the blades from 22 turbines. Those were the ones that were made up in Canada. So there's far more. I don't know how many with blades, but yeah. So it's not. It's not every single one, but it is pretty much a huge number. So they have to come down, and I don't know, blades made from somewhere else. And I agree with Jim. Vineyard Wind definitely has reached out to the fishermen. Well, scallopers, if you will, though that's squid grounds where they're at. I know they're not too happy for the most part. But anyway, yeah, I've done quite a bit of work for Vineyard Wind. They've been good to me anyway. But again, I'm not pro wind. If you put them in the right places, you shouldn't take away jobs to create jobs. That's ludicrous. It's just insanity.
I want to get away from wind for just a second and go right to Framework 39 and what that's going to do for the year ahead. You guys correct me if I make a mistake, because I'm not an expert on this, but so as I understand it, Framework 39 reduces the number of trips you can make for the scallop grounds from 3 down to 2, but it increases the number of trips to the open ocean. The scallop cycle is at a low ebb now, and they're hoping that if they have these regulations, it'll be back by 2027. So is this a tough year ahead for us, Eric?
It is a tough year ahead. I mean, the total landing is going to be down, even with the increased days at sea fishing. We're going from 20 to 24. Uh, our catch per day is down, so we would need 30 or 40 days to catch what we used to catch in 20, because the resources at it. Surveys that were done last spring showed a lot of small scallops, so there is promise for the future. There were some areas that had record-setting tows of small scallops, thousands and thousands of scallops that were in one tow. So if they all survive and grow, we are looking to rebound in a couple of years.
So I noticed that the Sustainable Scallop Fund, the Fisheries Survival Fund, and Mayor Mitchell are all supporting this framework. It seems like a bitter pill. Is there no other way to do it, Drew?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so I work with Sustainable Scalloping Fund. We support it, no one's thrilled about it. But when you look at the evidence in front of you, it's the best that we could hope for in the current situation. The fact of the matter is there aren't a lot of adult scallops in a lot of the access areas or the open bottom. I mean, only a couple of years ago, the fleet was averaging over 3,000 pounds a day on an open bottom day. Now catch has been below 1,000 pounds. So, you have to face reality, excuse me, and you have to, take the right measures when the resource is down. Scallops recruitment is cyclical. It's a boom or bust cycle. We're riding out, 8 years of bad recruitment. We've seen signs of good recruitment that makes us hopeful that we'll have a good scallop fishery in about 2027. But when we talk about recruitment, people need to understand that when you first see a scallop in a survey, it's about 4 years before it actually becomes large enough to enter into the fishery. And we want to make sure it's large enough so that we know it's reproduced several times before it's harvested. That's part of the success that why we have success in the scallop fishery. And so you have to be prudent and you have to be patient and take your medicine when it's required.
I think a lot of people don't realize that the industry itself, the fishermen, the fishing boat owners, they're not anti-environment. They may not always agree with the federal regulations, but it's their resource too. Jim, could you speak to that about fishermen and the environment?
Well, I guess it's sort of like a love-hate relationship because it impacts us to try and do the right thing. Well, others can sit back and look and say, well, it's either right or it's wrong, and they approve or they disapprove. And they don't particularly care what harm it causes to the industry itself. The industry for years has tried to make it better, so to speak, because it benefits the industry to have it that way. And, one of the things that worries me about the offshore wind, to get back to that point, is that we're changing the environment. So that worries me greatly. We're putting rocks where rocks never existed as part of the scouring, protection for these towers. And I'm afraid that might harm the future for the fishermen. And they're the ones who likely will be blamed for anything that occurs offshore. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that we have to do what we should do and what we can do, and we ought to get the credit for what we have done. So I think that kind of puts us in a tough position, but it does benefit us.
As these scientific studies come in on the effect of the turbines on the fishery, if it does turn out to be as bad as people fear it might be, is there coming back from it, Eric? Is it just going to be, oh, we ruined the fishery for this experiment with wind?
That's why I say this pause that was mandated yesterday is beneficial. We'll be able to do a little more study to document things before the whole East Coast is built out. Because the past administration wanted to lease out almost all of the continental shelf and put in thousands and thousands of turbines. That's not going to happen now in the near future. It may still happen in the distant future, but at least we'll be prepared, with scientific studies to show the impact of what is already in the water has on the resource. When you put structure in the water, you're going to change currents. all scallop larvae, when they're first born, are floating in the currents. It's going to change where they settle. It's going to change where the predators are, because you change the environment. You're putting rocks weren't before. So things are going to change. We know that. We just don't know the extent of the change. And like I say, this pause from the executive order is gives us time to see that.
Mhm.
What
Is it possible we'll find out that they can coexist, or are you really doubtful about that?
I
one of the- yeah, I wanted to say that one of the,
Jim,
go ahead,
Go ahead, Jim.
Eric. No, I'm sorry. What I was going to say is one of the things that we're really missing is the great information that should be available from Europe. I mean, they've been doing it for years, but we very seldom get any feedback or any information from that. And that's really a travesty when you look at it that way. I'm sorry.
I read something this morning that in Europe, all the guys that used to be fishermen are just working for the wind industry now. They don't do any fishing, and I was wondering, well, why would they, if there's money to be made, unless those turbines in Europe did adversely affect the fishery?
Well, they certainly adversely affected it. And also in every country but England or the Great Britain, you're banned from fishing within the array. So whether or not you could or couldn't was irrelevant. You were disallowed from fishing in those wind arrays. So you lost those fishing grounds. And that was, there's no coming back because, there's two different impacts from offshore wind on fishing. There's the direct loss of fishing grounds because of gear conflict and not being able to operate within them. And then there's the impacts on the overall environment, as Eric was speaking to, changing the currents and the predators and the ecosystem. And I think people need to recognize that it's more than, there's the direct and the indirect, and they're significant when you add them all up, and especially at the scale that the previous administration was planning to employ offshore wind.
Yeah. What are the reasons for the declining scallops? Some people say it's the turbines. Some people say ocean warming. I've also read that maybe a glut of vessels, too many vessels. Um, uh, Maybe a combination of them all. Anybody have any theories on that?
Well,
Um,
the
Go
industry
ahead,
has
Jim.
immediate impact by being able to work the large scallops. There's plenty of scallops out there from what the reports say, but I think, like Eric said, it's mostly a lot of small stuff that needs time to grow. But the biggest problem is we got a bank or a safe that's locked out there that we can't get into that's holding an awful lot of resource.
Would that be the northern edge? Where are we talking about?
Go ahead, Tony.
Well, yeah, well, definitely the northern edge is one place. And it's again, I'm going to use the word ludicrous. The most insane place to close to bring back the fish. Ask Jim. Ask Eric. But just between the three of us, we've got close to 150 years of fishing, and a lot of it in the warehouse. We hardly caught fish up there. Where in the oh my God, where in the heck are they getting it? I worked for NIMS for 6+ years. I did three surveys if you call scallops into the edge, all over, up and down the coast. And again, if there's one place I never caught fish or hardly caught fish, was the northern edge. Um,
Just for those of you who might not know, the lay audience that's watching this program, the Northern Edge is a part of the Georges Bank that has been closed to scalloping for a long, long time, decades, and they're trying to get it reopened. And when Tony says he worked for NIMS, he means the National Marine Fisheries Service, the federal government.
I worked on their previous, the old Albatross 4. It was their old research vessel that got replaced by the Bigelow. But I could go on and on. I was actually working for NIMS when they opened up the southern part, and the chief scientist at the time was Frank Almeida. And he says, you know, we're going to go down to do a before and after cruise. And I was shocked. You know, I was shocked because I'm like, you're opening up the southern part. That's where the fish are. That's where we've been fishing now off and on for, I don't know, close to 20 years. I'm like, that's where the yellowtail are. That's where I caught cod. That's where I caught haddock. And he just shrugged and like, well, this is what the higher ups want me to do. And we went. I know people, I still have good friends up at National Marine Fisheries. And I ask them, what are you seeing up on the edge? And they say the same thing. We're hardly seeing any fish up there. We're not catching much. So the justification is insane. If I could bring that meeting we did before Christmas there at the Marriott Hotel, which Eric and Drew were there, I was frustrated. I asked, his name was Patrick Sullivan. He was the head of the meeting. He apparently he's advisory to scientific. I don't know. Eric could fill in all that, but I basically asked him. I basically said, look, I'll shut my mouth once and for all if you could just tell me one good thing that came out of the northern edges 30 years of being shut down. And Mr. Sullivan looked at the Bora Hart on one side, and I don't know who the other gentleman was. Then he looked at me and he said, summer flounder. And it was like somebody punched me in the gut. Summer flounder is fluke. I never seen fluke in there. I have seen it just outside of that area, which is very rare. Fluke accounts for 5% of the fisheries in the East Coast. Not that it diminishes it. Nobody's ever fluked up there, but hey, job well done, I guess.
So they're protecting the summer flounder at the expense of the much bigger scallop.
Again, yeah. I'm not trying to diminish one fishery for the other, but I mean, like I said, I've been in there where most of us haven't with the research, and even a year later, there was huge amounts, and up to upwards of 30% were already dead. They were clappers. And in other words, they're just shells. Still, the hinge was attached to two shells, and there was no meat in it, no nothing. And the chief scientist at the time basically said, "Well, that's the predators." And I looked at him. I says, "Okay, you show me one predator in that pile, just one predator, and I'll believe you." And there was no predators in. So, what were they dying from? I don't know.
Drew, I think Tony's getting that frustration that I have heard for the
Yeah,
25 years I've been in
yeah.
New Bedford, that the regulations don't actually fit what's out there that the fishermen are seeing out there because it's hard to measure the ocean. What do you think about this
No,
disconnect?
it's a good question. There's a lot of frustration with the northern edge in particular, because of all the areas surveyed in the scallop survey, that area has the second highest abundance of scallop biomass, and we haven't been able to fish in there for almost over 30 years now. So it is a source of frustration. The rationale for why we haven't been able to fish in there is, even though there's no evidence supporting the claim that it somehow increases productivity of groundfish. I think everyone can look at the current state of the groundfish fishery and judge for themselves on the effectiveness of that. But one of the things that's unique about the scallop fishery is that we do a lot of our own surveys. The federal government does a survey, but Tony participates in surveys with his vessel. Eric participates in surveys with his vessel. We have our research partners at UMass Dartmouth, SMAS, School of Marine Science and Technology, the Virginia Institute of Marine Science down in Virginia, and also the Coonamessett Farm Foundation all do annual surveys. And so with the industry participating in them, one, we get better information. We get it at a much better cost than it was just done by the federal government. And in fact, even the federal government's now contracting with commercial fishing vessels to do part of the survey, the dredge survey. And we use dredges and cameras. And between all of that, we have as good of an understanding of the scallop biomass as any fishery does. It's not perfect. There are things that get missed in every year. But because the fishermen participate in it, there is a better understanding and acceptance of what's going on because we're part of the process. Very rarely in the scallop fishery, when we're debating what to do next, do we argue about where we are in the map. The question is, how do we get to where we want to be? Whereas I think it's fair to say other fisheries, there's often a lot of disagreement about where you are in the status of the fishery. And right now, scallops aren't in their best state. This year we've landed so far 15 million pounds. We might get up to 18 million pounds or so. But to put that in for perspective for viewers, scallop landings for the last 18 years have hovered between 40 to 60 million pounds most years. So we're down. And next year we'll probably be down in this 15, 18 million pound range again. And one of the big factors is the scallop fishery has two main areas that the fleet operates. The Mid-Atlantic, so east of the Delmarva Peninsula up to south of Long Island, and then Georges Bank, which is southeast and east of New Bedford. We used to easily harvest 20 to 30 million pounds of scallops out of the Mid-Atlantic. That was routine. Areas like Elephant Trunk, Hudson Canyon, and then Virginia Beach and Delmarva, and even Virginia Beach when I first started. This year, there probably only going to be about 2 or 3 million pounds to come out of that area. There was the scallops aren't there right now. There are several theories as to why. One of the biggest one promotes a lot of warm core rings have spun off the Gulf Stream in the last few years. And the warm, scallops have a temperature threshold. They only can survive up to about 20 degrees centigrade before they start dying off. The water's been cold this last couple of years. And, it's as cold as we speak now. So no one knows if that's the new normal or if that was just a temporary thing. And then the new cycle is going to come in. We'll have cold bottom water temperatures. But that is a big factor as to why scallop biomass is down overall right now, is just we're not catching a lot out of the Mid-Atlantic.
Well, I wonder, Eric, just remind our viewers that Eric sits on the New England Fisheries Management Council, which makes recommendations to the federal government for regulations of the fishery. What has been the holdup of getting the northern edge opened again?
Northern edge, when there was a habitat amendment, it was created as a HAPC, a habitat area of particular concern for groundfish spawning, codfish spawning. And that once that designation is reached, it's tough to turn it around. And there are other environmentalists that sit on the council. And with codfish being as in dire straits as they are, they didn't want to do anything at all that would jeopardize codfish. Now, if this area is designated as important to codfish, they weren't going to give access to scallopers. So that's why it gave them heartburn that scallopers wanted access. Tony is going to disagree that, codfish are even present there. I'm not even sure how good the science is. I spoke to some professors that have studied codfish, and the habitat that's on the northern edge, which is cobble and gravel, is important for codfish spawning inshore. This isn't inshore. This is the same type of habitat with cobble and gravel as inshore where the spawning grounds are, but for some reason it was designated as important to codfish, even though there's very little documentation that it is a spawning ground. But that's why the council had heartburn on giving scallopers access to areas that were designated as important to codfish.
Okay, I got both Tony and Jim with their hands up. Tony, you go first.
All right. That's funny. Codfish spawning ground. Here we have a known, proven, designated cod spawning ground 3 hours from New Bedford, 3 to 4 hours, Cox's Ledge. And actually, Mr. Sullivan at that meeting claimed he worked with Boehm on that. Now, to what degree that means, I don't know. Was he pro allowing it to be devastated? And that's what I'm calling it. I know for a fact I've caught codfish there, and it was always fairly small cod, which we basically, a few times we've gone in there, we left. because the cod was too small. They have data where they've tagged codfish there, 4 hours from New Bedford, 3 hours from Point Judith. They tagged cod there, and it was caught up in, I believe, Iceland, and vice versa. They've tagged codfish up there in the Nordic Sea, and it was caught down here. It is a proven, known codfish spawning ground, but yet these environmentalists, because you say the wind is green, allowed, surveying that bottom using the seismic, which is whether or not it harms whale, I don't know. So that happened. They allowed pile driving in there. They also moved a ton of boulders out of that area. They totally restructured this, in my interpretation of a crucial habitat. It is a place like Cox's Ledge. There's no disputing it. So if they use the same criteria in either place, then they would have never allowed what's going on there, or they would have allowed us in. If they used, you follow me, if they were using the same criteria to allow that, they sure as heck would have allowed us up on the edge. It's a double standard, and the last time I checked, it's called hypocrisy.
Yeah, I think that's what frustrates a lot of people, that the science bends to what the answers they're trying to.
Exactly, and the science is there that proves and shows that Cox's is a spawning ground, but yet we can do whatever this past administration desires.
Jim Kendall.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of points I'd like to make. First of all, I agree with Tony as far as Cox's Ledge. I fished there 30 years ago. I fished around there 30 years ago. It was too rough a bottom for the most part for scallopers to fish in that area, and we seldom went there. But when things were desperate and we were looking for big scallops to mix in to make what we used to call a count, like Tony described it. And he also didn't mention the monkfish that's there. Monkfish go there to breed, and there was almost a war over there with monkfish fishermen because they were who was catching the monkfish and so forth and so on. But anyways, one of the things that's been brought up is the fishing year. It's not a calendar year. It doesn't start January 1st and end at the end of the year. We've changed our fishing year, and it used to be the beginning of March, and now they want to move it further into the growing period for the scallops, so that we lose the advantage of the way scallops reproduce is important to that. But anyways, I've got to leave for about 5 minutes, so if you'll excuse me, I'll be back right away as soon as I can.
That's fine.
My wife calls.
This is the wonder of Zoom. We're all in it. In the interest of fairness, I have a question coming in from the environmental side that I'll put to the panel. This is from Chuck Smiler, a New Bedford guy. He wants to put the question of offshore wind in the larger context of climate and marine environment change. How might the ocean warming, plankton growth, current changes, and acidification affect the scallop resource? I'll go to you, Drew, first.
Sure.
So
I guess the premise of the question is, with offshore wind, the idea is that climate change will be delayed or thwarted in some way. And the problem I have with that premise is that if you read the actual environmental report on Vineyard Wind and other projects, up front they say that they don't predict there to be an actual negative carbon offset from the offshore wind between the construction phase and then all the service boats that have to go out there and everything else. There isn't a net decrease in carbon emissions from offshore wind projects. So there's that. But that being said, I mean, fishermen people always ask, well, why don't fishermen support these if climate change is impacting their fisheries? Isn't this a good thing? Climate change is, it's happening out there. People are seeing changes in the water. There's no doubt about it. And they are concerning. But I would posit to anyone, what is more concerning? Some changes that are slightly moving things around, or a project that goes right in the middle of where you make your living and then you can no longer make your living. That is a more immediate threat. So if we want to address climate change, yes, let's do that. But can we do it in a manner that doesn't dispossess fishermen of their fishing grounds and disenfranchise them from their livelihoods? That's the debate.
Eric?
I really don't have much to add to that. I mean, Drew did a good job. It's debatable on whether there's going to be any impact as far as carbon goes, wind power, warming. I know a lot of, if there's long transmission cables, they have to be cooled. They're talking these cooling stations, these transmission stations, when they change AC power, which is generated by the wind turbines, to DC power to transport to shore. The cooling water that's required is somewhere the amount of 6 million gallons a day of water that's 90 degrees. And 6 million gallons of 90-degree water sounds like an awful lot to me. And that's not for the whole East Coast, for each individual wind farm. So you multiply that, you're talking billions of gallons of warm water that they're going to discharge. That doesn't seem to be going against global warming. That seems to be contributing to global warming, if you ask me. So there are a lot of concerns with the total impacts. Plankton, algae blooms, things like that are current now. They might be beneficial to our resource because that's what scallops eat. There's all kinds of different types of plankton. So I get that, some algae blooms, the red tides and things like that are not good, but it goes both ways. There's good plankton, there's bad plankton. When they die off, they create an acidic, bottom too. So that's been happening for years and years. And I don't see how wind power is going to change that.
Yeah, we have a guy named Andrew Carr has written in about the study should have been done fully before the federal government allowed these turbine farms. I wonder if they could have done a smaller group of them first and done studies before they permitted them all up and down the East Coast. Would that have been better? Anybody?
I pushed for that years ago to start small and to go slow. Had a conversation with Janet Coit just a few years ago before Vineyard Wind got permitted, and I said, "Slow down. Let's do it and study it before we build out the whole East Coast." And she told me, "Well, that's not the goals of this administration." So it was from higher ups, in the administration to push for wind power.
So how
unfortunately this past administration, their goal, their approach to offshore wind was ready, fire, aim. It was predetermined that they had a projected goal and they were going to get there. And, they did not want to hear any questions about the approach. And I think that's what really upset the fishing industry in a lot of ways. Is they felt unheard and, that no concern was given for their plight.
Yeah, it may surprise a lot of people to learn that the first time that we heard about offshore wind came from a fisherman, Danny Cohen, who was a boat owner and industry owner, and brought the information to New Bedford, and we had a big meeting over at the Whaler Museum where they put forward a plan to develop fishermen's energy, which would have been an offshore wind plant design or an area built by fishermen and run by fishermen. And they were the first ones to bring that information before us. The Massachusetts government and its federal government never said a word about the offshore wind, or what we used to call the Terry dot. There was a plan, or the initial plan was to build wind farms, basically from Rhode Island all the way out to the middle of the channel, which is halfway out into Georges Bank. But it was brought forward by a fisherman, and fishermen were signing on as investors to that plan. And it was turned down. and that was when the finally the state brought the plan forward, and it was with offshore and foreign developers, nothing to do with the American fishermen or anyone else. So if the fishermen had had the opportunity to do it first, it might have been done right.
I just play devil's advocate here. From the perspective of the other side, they say that we are in a climate crisis. We're having all these storms. Drastic things could happen. We need to have a bunch of alternative energy now. How would you respond to that?
How's it working out for Europe?
I'd say put them on shore. Start along the shore. Put them along the coast. There's plenty of places to put these things that would be, far more affordable to even the wind farms. They would rather, I'm sure they'd rather put them along 3 and 5 miles out. Yeah, they may be ugly, but ugly doesn't cost jobs.
Yeah. Now, Tony, you make a good point, because especially one of the states that's pushed offshore wind the most is the state of New York. And, they have their climate change goals. And we've had several conversations with them that, the governor there said nothing can be within 14 miles of the coast, to protect the viewshed, especially the Hamptons. And the fact of the matter is, once you go offshore, once you get more than 3 miles offshore outside of state waters, you increase your conflicts with fishing, because fishing occurs further offshore. So if they wanted to decrease conflicts with fishermen, they wanted to decrease costs of constructing these facilities. If they wanted to lose less power, because as long as you transfer electricity along these long transmission cables, you lose power. Nothing's perfectly efficient. So if you wanted to actually have a better product, a cheaper product, and do it quicker, they could have done it in state waters. For political reasons, they chose not to.
Okay for the fishermen to suffer, but not for the people who own mansions in the Hamptons.
Yeah. Those evil 1%ers don't want to look at it,
Tony, you've talked about the cost of gear, food, and fuel all being up 40% since the pandemic. Can you talk about what it's been like for you trying to make a living out there? Because I don't think people fully understand what dire straits some of the scallopers are in.
Well, no, everything has gone up. I mean, a painter paint with $35 an hour. The paint, upwards of $100 a gallon. Again, shackles. We used to buy a bag of shackles for $100. They're up over $200. The chafing gears is up 40-50%. Well, thanks to this administration and the insurance, the interest rates, our mortgages are $5,000-$10,000 more a month. So everything has gone up, and our quota's gone down. So I'm part owner of 6 boats, but the only one that are keeping me and my bills paid are the few boats that are involved in this charter work I do. So we're just, we've had great years, but that's not what business is about. That's the other thing most people don't understand. Businesses don't lock into a fix. We go with the adjustable. That's business.
Yeah. Speaking of the work that you do with the wind farms, Anastasia Lennon from the New Bedford Light had a good story the other day about the fact that there are 45 fishing boats that have been working with the wind industry as safety vessels, guard vessels, science vessels, helping them as they put these things in. And they brought in about 8 million, which is not what you would make scalloping, of course. But Tony, you talk about that. People have called you a trader and different things. Talk about why it's necessary to work with the wind industry.
Well, I mean, if I didn't do it, somebody else will. Like I said, I was able to turn a profit and give extra work not only to myself but my guys. I got to watch this thing. I was out in Vineyard Wind when they were just started dumping rocks. I watched these things being built. Again, I haven't scalloped in that general area in 30 years. But you know, like I said, there's been 45. There's a ton of boats waiting, trying to get in. You know what I mean? Any work is good work, but not if it's going to, you know, kill us or whatever, take our fishing grounds from us. If you follow me.
Lou, what is the latest on the scientific studies on the effects of turbines on the wind? Now that Trump has called for this moratorium, is there a chance for some of them to get done? Or
Well, Drew was saying that, Drew could probably answer that. They have it's not like anything that's already been started can be taken away. You know, a lot of these wind, like Vineyard Wind, there's no way Trump could stop them. You know what I mean? They're all the monopiles are in, a good 40 or 50 towers and generators are up. They just have to get the same thing with the other one here on Cox's. Oh boy, I keep getting that name wrong. Yeah, there's no
Revolution.
way. What was it, Eric?
That's Revolution.
Revolution wind.
Revolution Wind.
Well, Revolution, but they're all partners.
Another one is Sunrise.
Yeah, well, they're all partners with the other
Ørsted.
big company, Ørsted. Thank you. Yeah, Ørsted.
There's going to be a lot of lawsuits going back and forth the next few years with this. Drew or Eric, do you want to weigh in on the scientific studies?
So, I mean, that's one of the frustrations that's been with the development of offshore wind. There hasn't been a lot of upfront science or understanding of the impacts. It's a wait and see what will happen, and we're kind of flying blind. Through the scallop research set aside, so the scallop fishery takes 1.25 million pounds every year and sets it aside and uses the funds generated by that 1.25 million pounds to generate funds to fund scientific research. And it's a federal grant program. And so that is funded work by some scientists at SMAS that are trying to do a modeling study. And what they've been able to model so far is that there will be significant disruptions to the current patterns in the area. And that will then in turn lead to disruptions to the normal larval distribution. Because remember, scallops spawn out into the water column. They're not free swimming as juveniles. They are taken wherever the currents take them, and that's very important into how the species has evolved and how the successive recruitment. Because if a scallop spat or juvenile doesn't land in an area that's conducive to growth, it will just pass away. And so you need a lot of the spat to land in good scallop habitat, and that's caused by the current system. So if you disrupt that, you can disrupt the recruitment process, and that's one of the big concerns with offshore wind that we're just only beginning to understand. But that's part of this pause that's now happening with the executive order. The hope is, a pause is only as good as you're going to make it. So hopefully we will do a lot of science, be better armed with better understanding going forward, so that whatever lies ahead in the next 4 years, we'll be better able to confront these issues.
Tony.
Yeah, so like Drew was saying with the spat, yeah, the spat definitely flows all south of the islands between the two existing wind farms there. And I know this for a fact because of the acoustic buoys that we haul and set in there. And I've showed pictures to Eric, and I have them here. So they will cling on to anything as they drift. And if they can cling on, they anchor up until they get big enough and then drop down and settle there. So now with these wind farms there, any spat that flows through there and can cling on to anything there will end up settling there. And I think actually Kevin Stokesbury there from SMAS mentioned that over time there will be scallops in there. But yeah, so it definitely, is it a pro? Is it a con? So the more things you have in the path of this spat, is it a good thing? I think not. I think you're messing with nature.
Eric, you get your hand up.
Yeah, you talk about science and the impacts, and I think in order to judge any impacts, you need a good baseline. There is no flat line where, scallops land in this certain spot every year. It takes many years to get an understanding of where things are. So for a baseline study, you need 5 to 10 years of data. We're late in getting 5 to 10 years of data to judge impacts. Nature changes every year a little bit. When you get a change that's out of the natural variance, that can be the impact for winters. But if you don't have a baseline study that has an average of what's there before, you can't really blame impacts to wind farms. That's one of the problems with the fisheries in Europe. They had no baseline studies. There was no
Really?
notice that they were going in before. Fishermen were just told, well, we're going to put wind turbines there, and 2 months later they were there. So any impacts that the fishermen say is hearsay because it's not documented. So
Jim Kennedy.
I think.
Oh, sorry, Eric. Go
No,
ahead.
go ahead.
Jim.
Thank you. I was lucky enough to be approached, like I say, early on in the process of the wind farms. And I think one of the things that I can kind of take pride in is the fact that I introduced them to SMAS. And I brought Eric Stevens over there, and we met with the current dean and started that process working. And that's, to me, that's been one of the greatest things that we've been able to produce, is get that type of work done with SMAS and BIMS and Ron Smolowitz's group. But early on, Brian Rothschild came out and started talking about how these wind farms were going to disrupt the wind. The wind patterns themselves are going to change, and that's going to affect the ocean currents and so forth. And, with
Water.
some of us are thinking, that's kind of far-fetched. But, at least we were able to try and do some groundwork, as Eric said, to do some work before they got there. And it's ongoing, and hopefully we'll find that there's minimal disruption, but I don't believe it. I believe there's going to be some severe impacts there, and that we're lucky that President Trump came in and put a halt to any further developments or planning, because we need that pause to try and protect whatever's going to happen. If it's not what we wish to happen, we'd never be able to stop it, if we hadn't currently done so. So, like I say,
Drew, with the I've heard that the scallop landings the last 3 years have been down as much as 50%, and something in one of Anastasia's articles that caught my attention was the idea of scallop enhancement from basically a scallop farm. You catch the spat, grow it out, and then transplant it back in the ocean. How far are we away from being able to do something like that?
It's a matter of will. Scallop enhancement is done as we speak. It has been done at a very large scale in Japan since the 1970s. It's done in several other countries. They've done prototype designs just to our north in Canada and proven that it is possible. We just had an excellent 2-day workshop on enhancement techniques in Providence, Rhode Island, just a couple of months ago. That was part of another scallop research set-aside project that funded that. So this is something that as someone who represents the Sustainable Scalloping Fund, this is something we're pushing very strongly, because right now, being reliant on the natural ebbs and flows of recruitment is, we would like to take that out, smooth out the landings, and also, be it wind farms or be it warming waters, the fact of the matter is we have to be able to harvest more scallops from less area going forward, or at least we have to be prepared to do so. Shame on us if the day comes and we knew this was coming, we didn't do anything about it. So this is something I am hopeful that we will have an enhancement program in place within the next 3 years. That is my goal.
Speaking of the Japanese, how big a problem is it, the entry of the Japanese scallops into the American market the last few years?
It's significant competition. They're able to produce a lot of scallops. They don't tend to produce the larger U10 scallop. That they more produce a 2030 or a 1020 size scallop. But and that's one of the reasons you see the split in prices right now on the New Bedford auction, because the U10 doesn't have that competition. It's able to get more of a premium price, whereas the smaller scallops have that international competition, and it drags down the overall price, no doubt. And Eric, I'm sure, can speak to as well.
Yeah, no, from my conversations at the New Bedford seafood auction just this past week, I asked about the counts that were coming in from Japan, and the count of scallops that's coming in is like 25 to 30 per pound. So any scallops that land in New Bedford in that count range are competing directly with those scallops, and they're coming into the shore at about $12 a pound. So a U10 scallop has been averaging close to $40 a pound. A 1020 has been averaging close to $20 a pound, and a 2030 scallop is under 15. So I'd like to think that the North Atlantic sea scallops have a better flavor. That's what I've heard. But I've also heard that it's hard to tell once they're breaded in season to tell the difference from the Japanese scallops. So it's a very strong competitor on the market right now, and it's driving the price for our smaller scallops, which the 25 to 30 count isn't really small. I mean, back when Jim and I started fishing, we were fishing on 40, 50, 60 scallops, or smaller sometimes. So it's only been the last few years when we've been fishing on the larger scallops, and the vernacular has changed, because we used to think a 2030 was a large scallop. Now the crew says it's small.
Interesting.
So it's changed. I'm sure Jim could speak to that part of it. How we've shifted our targets from.
So we only have about 5 minutes left. We only have about 5 minutes left, and I have a couple of questions I want to make sure I get to Tony, and others can speak on this too. The issue of multiple permits on a boat has been raised that would help some of the small boat owners. Some of the regulations, the way they've been, some folks have argued that they've tended to allow these big, boats, people who own a fleet to be favored with the permit system. And if you could have multiple permits on a single boat, if I understand it correctly, it would help. Is that right, Tony?
Oh yeah, well, it definitely would help me. Yeah, well, a lot of the like captains that work for us or other, independent boat owners, they protested it. I think basically because they thought by protesting and stopping it, it would ensure that what they've been making. In other words, they've done quite well. The younger generation versus myself and Eric, when we started out, I mean, we weren't doing as well as what this younger generation has done. And then the single boat owners are worried or whatever. I don't. If you do it right and you do it fair, I mean, you've got guys getting all kinds of RSA. That's leasing. That's stacking. I just want to put two permits, similar permits, same size, same horsepower on one boat. It cost me $60,000 last year to paint one boat. $60,000. That's a lot of money. You know what I pulled out of that boat? Nothing. It's foolish. I mean, two 12,000-pound trips and 24 days. How many calendar days in the year is that? That's what? 35 days, maybe, 40 days. What business can survive on just that at today's cost of inflation?
Drew, what about the permit system?
Yeah, so currently, as you guys just mentioned, a scalloper only goes to sea about 35 days a year. So for over 300 days a year, it's sitting at the dock. And the way the regulations are right now is that you have to have one permit on one vessel, and that's all you can have. However, the rest of the industry has evolved. I mean, captains now all fish multiple vessels. There aren't any, either 2 or 3 vessels in a different year. And the reason they do that is because you can't consolidate the permits onto one boat. So you have to hop from boat to prosecute the fishery. And this has been identified as a problem in this fishery going back to 2008. The agency did a report at the request of Congress on overcapacity in fisheries. And they looked at data in the scallop fishery back in 2004, 2005, when there were 7 18,000-pound trips in 48 days at sea. And they identified the fleet, when the fleet then was going to sea on average 100 days a year, they identified the fleet as having overcapacity then. So it was a problem then when the fleet was going out for 100 days. Now we're at 35 days a year on average. The vessels go out to sea. So the problem is even more acute. So it needs to be addressed. It's an issue that's not going away. Even if we doubled our landings, you're still talking 70 days a year. That's still a problem for overcapacity. One possible solution is stacking, where you allow 2 permits to go onto one vessel. But in my organization, Sustainable Scalloping Fund, we want to have the conversation about how to address overcapacity. And we want to make sure there are concerns out there. We want to have a conversation with people to address those concerns, because we believe that we can address overcapacity without harming the port, without harming other members of the industry. And we want to make sure we do it that way going forward. And so looking forward to having that conversation.
Great. Okay, Jim, I'm right up against my deadline. So quick.
All right. One thing I'd like to say is we used to fish nearly 300 days a year. So you can compare that to what's going on today. And I really think we need to continue this type of conversation, not only for scallops, but for groundfish as well. This is New Bedford.
Yep, let's do one on groundfish. Tony, I told you that you could talk about your frustration with who in the wind industry will allow you to the New Bedford boats to go out and do some of this safety and science work, and who won't. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Oh, well, yeah. So this other company along Cox's, they hire out a second or a third party or what have you. And then they take 25% of it instead of like Vineyard Wind. They work directly with the boat owners, the captains, the crew. Oh boy, Enron, whatever that other company is. Orsted, thanks, Eric. Orsted hires an independent contractor who in turns, hires whoever he wants, and they take 25%. They did reach out to me and said, okay, you're next. We're going to inspect your boat Wednesday. And then, one of the reasons they said they take 25% is because they say they put everything on the boat, safety, this, that, training. And then when I basically asked for what was supposedly to be given to the boat, all of a sudden there was no work for me. I mean, you've got Virginia boats up here working for them.
Okay.
Nothing against the Virginia boats, but what about all the boats in New Bedford and Point Judith and so on? But
okay, we got to wrap it up. Orsted, if you're out, the New Bedford fishermen want to share the wind work, so you're on notice. I want to thank all you guys for taking part in this. I was excited to do it. I love Jim's suggestion that we should do more of these, especially with groundfish. The scallop fishery, the groundfish fishery, they're complex economies, and people don't understand. If you couldn't follow some of the discussion today, there's lots of information out there. These guys are some of the best experts on the scallop industry in New England, and the New Bedford Light is just really lucky to have them today. So thank you, Jim. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Drew.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you to the New Bedford Light for its interest in covering these issues. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you for having us.
Alrighty.